Okay, you are live. I'll drop the live stream link in the chat and you're all set to
Perfect.
go. And I'll set you
Great.
back as host, Andrea.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, David. So I'll start first with reading on the policy, if you agree. Linux Foundation meetings involve participation by industry competitors, and it is the intention of the Linux Foundation to conduct all of its activities in accordance with applicable antitrust and competition laws. It is therefore extremely important that attendees adhere to meeting agendas and be aware of and not participate in any activities that are prohibited under applicable U.S. state, federal, or foreign antitrust and competition laws. Examples of types of actions that are prohibited at Linux Foundation meetings and in connection with the Linux Foundation activities are described in the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. If you have questions about these matters, please contact your company counsel, or if you are a member of the Linux Foundation, feel free to contact Andrew Updegrove of the firm of Gasmere Updegrove LLP, which provides legal counsel to the Linux Foundation. Hyperledger is committed to creating a safe and welcoming community for all. For more information, please visit our Hyperledger Code of Conduct. Perfect. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to have a very special meeting, and we're going to have a speech by DFM Data, Mr. Michael Darden, and on Fluid TUID. So I would love to lay stage Michael at once for him to have the speech and tell us about the solution. Michael, please say the word.
Andrea.
And, so.
Super. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So the fluid TUID, as we like to be able to call it, the TUID is a very serious subject that we thought needed a catchy name, and we're not locked into the TUID name, but for the introductory purposes, a fluid TUID will certainly serve the purpose. My name is Michael Darden. I'm the CEO of DFM Data Corp. I'm proud to be here today to introduce you and request for the expertise that you have be in thinking and in experience to be applied to a concept that we think will be very influential in digitizing or digitalizing the supply chain and logistics space. We noticed that there was some commonalities in the cash or order to cash cycle, and in the factoring business and in trade finance. And when Andre and I had an opportunity to be able to speak, we thought this was a good audience to be able to share this with. So with that, I'm going to kind of set the ground of a transaction as being a simple transaction between two people or two companies that know each other. And it all kind of starts with the fact that one company says that they need something from some place, and they're going to generate a purchase order for that to take place from somewhere. And the sourcing of that information is identified through a shopping mechanism of who the retailers are or who the suppliers are that can offer that. And ultimately, when a choice is made between two known parties, they will generate a corresponding sales order that relates to the purchase order to make the relationship between the parties. The next step that's going to take place is that there's a tie between the information and what they are promising to deliver with the information and the available inventory that they have to the destination that was the order point where the goods were being asked for. And this is still part of the pre-planning, non-execution side of the transaction, again, between two parties that know each other. The retailer is going to be able to assemble those goods and ship them to their customer for the processing of the receipt and the generation of an invoice so that they can resolve and conclude the transaction between the parties. This takes place with known parties pretty simply by just being able to pay the vendor that's in your system to be able to work with, because they've already been established and onboarded, and the transaction is ultimately closed from the cradle to grave side of the simple transaction from a retailer to a supplier. But if you just add the variables or some of the variables that take place in a transaction, such as the quoting process and the transportation providers that are involved, as well as the financing companies, the trade financing companies, and the factoring companies, there's several identities that get introduced by the different participants in the transaction, and each of them have to reference everyone else's reference number to be able to make it so that the transaction can get concluded. So we look at some of the variables that are involved in being able to make the consideration of how the retailer and the supplier are going to engage, and if they know each other, they've pretty much established a credit risk and an amount of terms for when they're going to make payments. And if they don't have an existing relationship with a supplier, or the supplier can't source the materials that are needed, there's an onboarding requirement that requires the establishment of the risk and the credit limits and the terms for being able to do the payments. But you can also, when you introduce new suppliers, bring in additional third parties, the trade finance groups that are factoring the payments or factoring the merchandise, or the factoring companies that are processing the movement of the funds for the service of delivering the goods. All of these unknowns bring in control numbers that really complicate the process, especially when you start to be able to look at today's capacity issues, where promise date and actual ship date are oftentimes being edited and changed because of lack of available capacity, lack of available equipment to be able to move the transport orders as are required. And in order to be able to get the known pricing of what the FOB point is on a shipment between the retailer and the supplier, there is a term that is often included in that purchase agreement that is the FOB point, that determines who's responsible for paying for the variability of the transportation resource. And that transportation resource is either going to be, again, a known resource or a new vendor that would also require an onboarding of their contact information and their account number and their credit line and such. So setting up the rules for operating with new companies, setting up the relationships of how trading partners can interact with each other is done over time. But in the moment, in the heat of the moment, when there is a requirement for delivery of a product and there's not a standard process, these variables just stack up on top of each other and become very complex elements of a simple transaction. So just to look at the transportation side of this, new technologies are coming into the marketplace related to that variability of how to find capacity. But ultimately, you have a shipper and the ultimate recipient, and they have a load that needs to be sent because of that order that we just talked about. But what's happening is that shipper is not always able to go to just the primary carrier. They have to be able to look at what the market will bear. And the market then brings them different capacity at different pricing so that they can make an effective decision based off of availability. And when they make that decision, they are presented with the options that marketplace was aware of. They choose a carrier, and that carrier gets selected to be able to go move the shipment. But in today's competitive landscape, where a marketplace may not have the capacity to be able to meet a specific transportation need, the fragmentation of this marketplace lends itself to not have continuity of the data across the partners that don't know each other. And it creates a very confusing landscape of how to navigate the transaction selections, because you'd have to be able to interface with so many partners that are doing different parts of the entire ecosystem. So in today's world, where it's much more competitive to find capacity, a shipper's not just looking at one marketplace, but they're actually extending their needs to multiple marketplaces. And those marketplaces that are digital marketplaces are extending that identification of demand to other partners that are in turn pushing that information to other partners, and in turn making it so that we have replicated copies of the same demand all through the supply chain in the shopping phase. But this gets kind of washed when a decision has been made to who to select for the carrier, and that carrier takes place. The only problem is that everybody else that was thinking or looking at that opportunity is still looking that it's a real opportunity, but it's already been consummated by someone. Our concept is that we're seeking to get comments and opinions and feedback and pushback for how this could really influence this industry, is that there is a merger of the information that really should be containerized, where that information can hang on what we're calling a transportation unit identification number. And at the moment of the demand and the supply being confirmed, there is a certainty that there is future action to take place. There's a promise for delivery that has been made. And that span from the moment of the delivery to the actual delivery of the payment is where trade finance gets involved. And what I think is really relevant here is that the 71 ships with an average of 4,300 containers that are sitting currently off the port of Long Beach are oftentimes having trade finance underpinnings behind those purchase orders. And without a promised to delivery date, there is an additional tying of capital to transactions for longer period of times than was initially allocated. So being able to actually understand the what I'm talking about by a common identifier being a transport unit ID, and tracking that from its original conception of a transaction through the point of payment is the place that we're seeking to gain the commentary of this industry for executing an identifier that would bring this together. And I've added a reference at the bottom of this page for an SAP YouTube video where they discuss the interlacing of the information inside of their own closed networked participants. And it's insightful, but I think it's still limiting to just companies that are in the SAP world, whereas the transportation unit identification has the opportunity to be able to span well beyond just that transaction movement of the tracking and tracing side, but actually the entire shopping and consummation of that load information. So what we've realized is that as COVID has hit and really pushed this digital requirement of asking for demand or their demand to be met with capacity in the dynamic marketplace, there is duplicated loads. There are duplicated capacities, if not multiplicated capacity and loads. And you know, when this was a small segment of the marketplace that was digitizing, it wasn't an impactful problem. But with the growth that we have seen in the digital requirements of moving freight, there is more inner and overlapping of capacity and demand that is not being regulated in the transportation and supply chain sector as it digitizes. And this is going to produce a bigger and bigger problem as the digitization takes a bigger foothold. The big problem, and I really want to thank Dr. Vic Uzumeri for his work on being able to put these many of these slides together, for being able to really articulate this. But the typical shipping process of the decision to source something and the decision to ship something and the carrier being selected to the carrier response, currently this blue box area is it's really muddy. You don't get a chance to be able to see much of what happens there, but it's really when the commitment of cost and expense is being evaluated. Most of the time, load identifiers are introduced after the carrier has been selected and it's been booked and the load has been built, and what's left to be done is just sign a bill of lading. What we believe is really a change agent for the movement of monies in microtransactions and concluding the settlement at the end with all accessorial charges, so that everybody that is involved as a stakeholder would have complete transparency of the data that they need to be able to reconcile, is that at the moment that the decision to ship has been made and prior to the time that the carrier has been selected, that there is a creation of a recipe, a digital recipe to be able to produce a number. And we really took the inspiration for this from the air transportation world, where there's passengers flying from every airport to every other airport on a myriad number of airlines. And it's a pretty seamless process because of the fact that we've identified a reference number at the moment of swiping the credit card and saying, I'm taking this flight. And by having this reference number produced at that point, it really unlocks not just the flight, but the airline's capacity and the hotels for the city that you're going to and the rental car that you might need when you get there, and can tie all of those transaction elements to the booking reference number, the place that the payment was assured. But in our industry, in the logistics and supply chain transportation industry, we don't currently create that number. Most systems produce a shipment number, a sales order number, and that sales order number is unique inside of their own system. But when you look at it in the aggregate, it doesn't allow for a uniqueness characterization, which is why we offer a recipe for creating the transport unit identification number. And we looked at the environmental elements of the fact that anybody who's going to be doing this is a business, and they are going to be some sort of identified business here in the States with a federal tax ID number or an EIN number. And anybody who has a business also likely has a phone number, and that phone number has some country code that's leading it to be able to identify where their origination of their order is coming from. And again, like I mentioned, all companies have some sort of an internal load ID number that they produce. But that load ID number really isn't quite randomized enough. But if you were able to concatenate those three elements of data and run them through a mechanism that's called hashing, which is often used for password security and other forms of data that are based off of generating identity, these unique characteristics of this hash could be produced at the earliest stage of a confirmation of the need and the supply, and use that TUID across the entire use of that transportation or that order's life cycle. So there's some interesting elements that happen with hashes and I know most everybody in this group is from the SIG of being able to work with Hyperledger. So hashes are not a new concept for you, but the programming language already have tools to be able to utilize the production and reading of hashes. And it's really a way to be able to produce and verify that the identity of the people that are activating or utilizing or accessing the information from this number, they're the only ones that would have access to this number. Randomly putting in numbers to be able to try to access the transaction would be a futile effort. We've seen with some computer and sophisticated technology of hacking that people can, do, especially now with mining operations as sophisticated as they are, that there is ways to be able to engineer ways into hashes. There's lots more to talk about in that space, but the concept of being able to take the variables of the transaction and of the shipper and converting it into the hash is the idea of how to be able to organize the fragmentation of the industry. So this is kind of an example of what that might look like. The TUI generator would recognize that the shipper account from the EIN information has attributes to it for and including the shipment that is leaving. So they have some things that are company based, related to their EIN and their country and their profile account, but the supplemental information for that of what's important for the shipment get incorporated into the TUID generator that produces this visibility of that same numbered identity being used through each one of the different communication touch points that need to be able to reference that transaction through the life cycle of the order. So we look at it and say, if this were the case, what would this do to the simplicity and the labor that is currently allocated to being able to match PO to sales order to invoice to bill of lading number to factor reference number? And when a common identifier comes into the beginning of this, the trip can begin to look like it does at the airport, where you walk in and enter your confirmation number to secure the record that is yours for that period of time. Everyone in the industry could do this on their own. They could create and adopt the mechanism for producing these TUID numbers and have it so that it works just like the airlines do, that we have a common way between different airlines to be able to reference the same thing. And with this first, as Vic refers to it, of the thin edge of the thin edge of the thin edge of the opportunity, we really see four plausible ways that industry, as fragmented as this, is going to change. And there is a possibility that one marketplace participant that is currently got a very small segment of the market would end up owning, with a better technical solution, anything that anybody else could do. But here in the continental United States dollar marketplace, and the likelihood of one winner winning is unlikely. So we don't think that's very viable. But the one that does make a lot of sense is to be able to incorporate things that are already in existence, organizations that have the structure of their industry and their perspective on what standards should look like and what participants should look like and what governance rules should look like and what technical interoperability should look like, could come from a group of industry associations that were interested in seeing the digitalization of this industry come to pass with collaboration, and some people call it co-opetition. But these companies working together in an environment that they were able to share and communicate in a trust environment, very similar to the antitrust provisions that were read at the beginning of this meeting. It's important to be able to have an open, disclosed space, or else the federal governments will recognize the need and already have recognized the need for the underlying data, and are putting efforts forth with their money and their grant programs and their research programs to be able to influence the direction of where things are going to come to. Or the industry could ultimately govern itself. And we think that one of the things that would facilitate that industry governing itself is being able to agree to this naming convention at a stage earlier than anybody else does, that wouldn't require anyone to rewrite their systems, but would simply be able to identify a way to make that identifier of that transaction transparent earlier on and through the life cycle. So our support, our objective, what we believe is the approach, is this industry governed utility, but it's going to have influence from the things that the federal governments have already started to be able to communicate that they're looking for. And oftentimes these organizations such as CSCMP, that has got their annual conference going on right now, I'm actually at that conference as we speak, they have initiatives that are aligned with being able to digitize in this space, and they're seeking to be able to collaborate with other industry associations to be able to make the digitalization of this space come to fruition. So the key to this is having that governance model. The participating nonprofit entities that have been advocating for their constituents and their audiences, they need to have a place where they can gather. They need to have a place where they can discuss and ideate about the things that need to be handled in the system, but they can't handle on their own, that require participation from loosely digitally structured working groups that allow for that ideation to be able to be considered by the working group's participants, and for them to be able to make recommendations to the steering committee about how to be able to implement those changes from a governance model perspective. And this model has been vetted through Dr. Blockchain. John Greaves has been involved in our program for a year and a half as our steering committee chair. He and Dr. Denise McCurdy have done really a phenomenal job of being able to establish the underpinnings of this governance model, up to and including the fact that we realize that we can't have the majority of seats in the steering committee. We have to be able to give those seats or provide the access to those seats to the community to be able to become part of this self-governing community. And part of this presentation today is to be able to communicate that we see ourselves in the ability to serve in this operating capacity, but that's transformative over time. As there's more committee members and working group members, the equity in DFM Data Corp is divisible by the number of participants that are in the ecosystem. They literally own the portions of DFM Data Corp that run the business side of the entity. So our objective was to be able to help facilitate this industry's adoption of the digital efforts, and we've taken some steps to be able to do that. We've created this entity that has the shareholder model to create equity of those participating companies participating with the governance model, where that member-led governance model is truly running with a Roberts rule and identifying the minutes and objectives of current business and future business and prioritizing objectives. We've also built a membership website that facilitates that ideation process that goes through the working groups and up to the steering committee, so that there is accountability of that information as written to a redundant repository. And the potential for interconnectivity and transactional interconnectivity is able to be accomplished with an engine and a data lake that we've constructed a prototype for, but are really seeking the participation of the community members to be able to stress test the environment that we've constructed. ultimately, this has to be set up from the customer and the universe of shippers and carriers working together to be able to standardize the things in this industry that are currently not standardized. We don't call transaction orders the same thing. They can be called orders or shipments or a numerous number of other names. And the objective that we seek to do is to help normalize those terms so that the industry's digital efforts can bring the transaction participants through the life cycle of that order, utilizing that transport unit identification number as a container to be able to hold all of that information, and agreeing with the governance model how much of that data is available for the constituents of the marketplace. So that's my presentation, and I welcome comments and questions. The DFM data team has participated in the preparation of this and of the governance model, and are on the call and able to engage in conversation as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So we'll leave space for question and answer time. I would encourage the attendants to make questions to Michael. It was pretty, we'd love to go deeper into this.
Hey, Michael, it's Eric from, go ahead.
Go on, Eric.
So, hey, Michael, my name's Eric in Canada, and very interesting presentation. Love the concept. I mean, yes, standardization's been a big part of a lot of efforts around blockchain these days. A lot of different parties are trying to establish a lot of different standards, but they still seem to be very data siloed. What would you see, except everybody jumping on board and saying, yay, finally somebody with a great idea of standard shipping IDs? What would you say is the biggest challenge? Because I come from the logistics world. I've been hearing about standardization and e-airway bills and all sorts of different initiatives around electronic transportation documents for about 20 years. And, we haven't made a whole lot of progress around standardization.
Agree. I agree with all of that. The standards work has really become focused on the places where the technology was deployed first. If you really think about how UPC codes and barcodes on product were so disjointed when they first came on the marketplace, and cash register systems didn't have a way to be able to produce a multi-code reader, and at the early days of being able to put labels on products for scanning at cash registers, there was very low level of compliance and acceptance. But as soon as the bodies, the GS1s, the IEEEs of the world, that they focus on a component of the supply chain or a component of an identified beginning and end of a transaction, that's typically when those standards get stickiness. And when we spoke with John Greaves a couple of years ago about this area, he was kind of flabbergasted about the fact that the gap between the standards that happen inside of a manufacturing operation for best practices just stop at the dock door when they're ready to be picked up by someone else. And I think in the past, like you said, over the last 20 years, there has been discussion about what could happen with an e-bill of lading, or what could happen if there was, but there wasn't a need for it. The capacity was just expected, that when you needed a truck, you could just go get a truck. And it might cost a little bit more if you couldn't get one of your favorite guys to be able to do it. But in today's environment where we're looking at a bullwhip effect and an overbuying of everybody in the marketplace that is consuming capacity and making it that people and companies are paying 4 to 10x what they were accustomed to paying just to secure capacity, the demand for standards and interoperability is higher than I've ever seen it in the 20 years that I've been in this space. So the challenge at this point is, I think everybody that is in the supply chain space who's now got the spotlight on them is having to shine in very difficult circumstances. And those very difficult circumstances are going to require us to be able to be more accountable for information than we have been before. And just saying it was on the ship and it's on its way across the ocean isn't good enough anymore. We need to know the track and trace and visibility of each one of those. And the only way that that's going to get addressed is not for every company to just go, yeah, we're in, but in our assessment, the intermediaries that are the digital enablement partners, what we call is contributing members, they are the ones that could facilitate this adoption of a TUID and have it into production in real time, being really impactful quickly. So our challenge at the moment is twofold. One, we want to be able to find supply chains that are from, and a good example is an OEM, where they're manufacturing multiple raw material parts that go to a manufacturing facility for subassembly, that go to another facility for assembly, and then go to another facility for distribution. When those multiple leveled supply chains are seeking this level of visibility, the identifier for them is a magic number. It literally is a recipe that they can bring to their entire ecosystem and say, I'm using this mechanism. This is the short code to be able to use it. It's an easy integration to do. Let's get started. So that's our target at the moment, is to be able to get some of those multi-level supply chains to be adopting the TUID mechanism, so that as the cross-pollination of those third-party and fourth-party providers are touching the TUID, they are experiencing the benefit of being able to have the visibility to that level of detail of the transaction.
Michael, can I add to that, or just give a slightly
Please do.
different...
Yes, sir. Yeah, sure.
One way to look at it is a lot of the previous standardization efforts have focused on the standardizing the transactions and typically the paperwork, and the method and the definitions, mechanics, etc. That is complicated, and that you get a lot of people disagreeing about how to do that. So then standards don't advance as quickly as one would hope. What we're talking about in this particular case is a much narrower concept. It's standardizing a single identifier, which can be used in anybody's documentation or anyone's system. If there's a system out there that can accept another data field, it can use the TUID. So the idea is to get that being used, hopefully in all the systems that are out there right now, in any form. The key is that if you generate a TUID when you conceive a load, and you communicate that to it directly to the intended consignee or recipient, they now have a clear identifier of what they should expect to receive. They'll start to ask the people in the process, hey, there's 20 trucks at the gate. Which TUID is it? What's your TUID? I mean, it's a much smaller standardization attempt than most or virtually anything that I've seen done before. And it's to try to just crack open the thin end of the thin end of the thin end of the wedge.
Because the layering of data on top of it, as we all know from a Hyperledger perspective, is able to be controlled of access and provisioning based off of roles and timing and statuses and all sorts of things that can be laced on top of it. But the first step is we got to call the same thing, no matter who's looking at it.
Does that answer your question, Eric?
It kind of does. I just see that it's an extra data field, like you just mentioned, that's on top of a whole myriad of extra data fields that we've had in the industry for a long time and haven't been able to standardize. So, you know, it is like I mean, you mentioned your airline, right? Your airline ticket has a booking number. Well, in air cargo, you have, from a data field perspective, you have the shipper's invoice or PO number. Then you have the local truckers picking up has a reference number. Then you have a freight forwarder that has a house airway bill number. And then you have the airline has a master airway bill number. And we haven't been able to standardize all these fields in 200 different countries and, you know, trillions of dollars of transportation. It's going to be a challenge to add another layer of data. Yeah, it's your standard, that's fine, and there's a recipe to it. I kind of get it. But where's the value if everybody still has a data silo?
Well,
in
the
their own right,
value
right?
is that all of those other numbers now mean much more to the full transaction. And if somebody is, especially when we start talking about trade finance, which may cover a big segment of that process, maybe even end to end, the fact that if they're, I mean, either you're going to take each of those individual step numbers, codes, and create the association and record it, which, I mean, this is a lot of what Hyperledger and so on is trying to do. So you can either do it as a chain of all these little pieces, or there could be one backbone skeleton field which goes from beginning to end. And the idea is that this is not adding much more complexity to the existing system, but in terms of, for example, error checking, it would be huge.
Yeah, but it's an intentional complexity that's being added for the benefit of the parties that are moving the transaction. It's not just another random number that came in. It's intended. It's the parties are somewhat identifying that we're agreeing from the very onset of what we're going to be calling this. And right now, that is such a huge problem across the dynamic market of the providers that haven't had pre-existing relations with people.
So if you want to do the things that the airline industry does, where your booking includes your car rental, you either have to build up the individual associations between the variables and the different ecosystems, maybe many to many, or the alternative is to generate one at the outset and just use it everywhere. And then you can have all the others if you need them. If they're already there, it doesn't hurt. But having a single ID from inception to cradle to grave is, especially in the case of what we're talking about, which is you can self-generate it. It's a recipe. It's not some godlike process giving it to you. You can make your own. Your SAP system can generate its own. That's sort of the intent behind the thought, is that if something were like that existed, that we would get start with some big shippers, some big receivers starting to ask for it. And it won't be that hard to add it, so people will. And once it exists, now we can build all kinds of interesting new initiatives, new products, new services, as the airline industry has.
And in this case, those are now things that are needed. I mean, I'm literally here at this CSCMP show, and every one of the sessions that we're talking about is the fact that people don't realize how bad this is yet. That they don't realize how displaced the empty shipping containers are, how displaced the chassis are, how displaced those pieces of equipment are that are going to need to be called into use. And if the optimization of those assets is what everybody at this conference is talking about, because you can't produce enough new factories for the supply chain changes that are taking place. You can't produce enough new vehicles or enough new semiconductor chips in a short enough period of time, because of the fact that there's been a pandemic and the demand cycle has changed so dramatically. I'm not a trade finance expert, but the thought of these 71 containers that are sitting out of the port, and a trade finance company made an agreement to be able to underwrite that transaction of that purchase order, and it's sitting there gonna be for the next 6 or 8 weeks. That's money that is committed that wasn't planned for. That there's exposures that haven't even been considered yet, that are the pins are already in motion to be able to make them happen. Us as an industry, we believe it's the right time to be able to really take control of the 20 years of digital time that the market has evolved, but that the supply chain hasn't had a chance to be able to really take on that big initiative of standardizing. Instead, they've had deregulation and companies that have stepped in with splinter solutions for specific things that they can sell to an individual company, as opposed to addressing the big problem. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate your question.
Thank you so much, Michael and Vic. Anybody else would love to make questions to? It's a very good one, by the way, Michael. I can tell you that from my perspective, being a trade fan, especially, the problems with container has created problems to the whole industry.
Yeah, and they're problems that are going to take a couple of years to unfold just from what's happened already.
Absolutely. To be back to normal, it's going to be quite troubled one.
Well, it's funny. I'll just touch on one presentation I watched earlier today that had a panel from EY and Delta Freight and Home Depot, and these companies have never ever had a problem accessing capacity from their trucking providers, because they've built good relationships and they've paid their bills on time, and they've never seen anything like this. I mean, you have supply chain managers that have been doing this for 20 and 30 years. It is an absolute change that they are selling to the carrier why the carrier should come to their location to be able to pick up, why they should take their freight instead of someone else's freight. And this is just the beginning. It's going to get worse. And controlling the information in a standards body mechanism will allow us to be able to work towards the optimized market and the optimized state. Whereas in the commercial market that I believe is unfolding here in the United States with the digital freight matching providers, they've built systems that are collecting price variability from carriers and their price acceptance to that variability, and shippers' price variability and their acceptance to it. And they're looking to make money, and they're making the gap between the two of them and calling that into a governance model that facilitates some rules and consistency around how to treat trading partners and how to maintain that information is the space that I think is a missing element of unstructured data at the moment, that the TUID really could facilitate the beginning of the categorization of that information from a marketplace perspective. And there lies our big opportunity.
Definitely, sir.
So Andre, we shared with you the white paper. I think we were going to put that up on your wiki page, and we thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to present to your audience.
Yeah, we'll upload them, maybe tomorrow during the day. So stay tuned. I will post you on this. So very soon I will tap right people. You see the slides, 2 days meeting, and the live recording that we're just going through.
Super.
Yep.
Any other questions? Happy to be able to answer while we're here. Very good. Andre, thank you very much for getting this set up for us.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, Michael. Thanks for this presentation. It was really, I think the subject is quite complex, but definitely interesting and fundamental in order to go for seamless, frictionless trade, which is essential. I mean, if you want to digitize the whole stuff. So it's me who thank you so much for giving so many highlights and let us understand what's going on in the USA specifically. So thank you very much. If nobody else would like to make questions, I mean, I would love to let you go and big goodbye to everybody, and glad to see you today, and glad to welcome you again in the next meeting. Going to have a new one in 8 days now. So hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Andre.
Bye, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.